One night in 2021, a security guard was working the night shift at a toll plaza located somewhere around Bandung, a major city in West Java, Indonesia. It was getting pretty late, presumably well past midnight, because traffic on the toll road had completely disappeared. In fact, there wasn't a single car visible in any of the lanes captured by the security camera. The toll booth area was still brightly lit, but beyond the plaza, the highway was pitch black and empty. Everything seemed perfectly normal, as usual. But then, the guard noticed something on one of the security camera feeds. You see, one of the CCTV cameras was pointed across the empty toll lanes, and in the top right corner of the frame, he could clearly see what looked like a pale white figure. At first, the guard couldn't quite make out what it was, but what he soon noticed was that the way it moved. The white figure started hopping in this weird and unnatural way, moving at a surprisingly fast pace. And from where the guard was sitting, it appeared to be hopping directly toward the toll booth where he was stationed. So he took out his phone and started recording what he was seeing. What you're seeing right now is the guard filming the CCTV monitor with his phone. You can then see the camera move away from the screen as he gets ready to go check outside. But when he stepped out of the toll booth and looked over the area, there was nothing there. So he came back inside, looked at the CCTV feed again, and the strange figure was still there, hopping towards him. That was when the guard went like, "Oh, hell nah," and just ran away. The CCTV recording you just saw was eventually sent to a famous Indonesian horror creator named Ewing HD by someone who said he worked as a security guard at the toll plaza. The footage went viral in 2021, and the story even got picked up by Indonesian news outlets and covered as actual news. To this day, the exact location of the toll plaza has never been identified, nor has the identity of the security guard, so there is no way to independently verify the authenticity of the footage. The only additional detail shared with the video was that there was supposedly a cemetery just 100 meters, roughly 330 feet from the toll plaza. And when the highway was originally constructed, some of the graves had allegedly been moved to make room for the road. Now, why am I bringing up something that happened in 2021? Two reasons. Number one, to show you that this mysterious white figure is actually instantly recognizable to most Indonesians, who would tell you that it is a pocong, which roughly translates to a shrouded corpse. Pocong is basically one of the most iconic ghosts in Indonesian culture, with stories about it passed down for generations. We'll get into exactly where the legend came from in a bit. Number two, to contrast the genuinely mysterious incident with what began happening across Indonesia from May 2026. Videos and photos suddenly started appearing online showing supposed pocong figures standing completely still outside people's homes or in residential neighborhoods in the middle of the night. These incidents quickly became known as the pocong terror. Except the theory was that these were not ghosts at all, but criminals dressed in pocong costumes, trying to frighten residents into staying inside while their accomplices robbed the nearby homes. Some of these fake pocong figures could even be seen carrying machetes or other sharp weapons. By the way, none of those alleged robberies was ever confirmed by police to the best of our knowledge. But thanks to social media and even AI-generated fake videos, the pocong terror panic escalated. It got to the point that on June 6, 2026, a local resident in Solo, Central Java, reported 3 men riding a motorcycle with one man wearing a pocong costume to the police. The police tracked the man down and even brought them in for questioning, but nothing came out of it because they found no evidence of criminal intent. The point is, people across Indonesia were scared enough by the presence of pocong to call the police, and the police took the threat seriously enough to investigate. So why are ghosts such a powerful part of modern Indonesian life? Why do stories about pocong, curses, black magic, and other supernatural forces continue to shape everything from viral rumors and police reports to religious rituals and some of the country's biggest movies? And how did the world's largest Muslim-majority country develop one of the richest and most active ghost cultures in Asia? Speaking of ghosts, there's actually one ghost I'm not scared to have around, and that's CyberGhost VPN, the sponsor of today's video. Whenever I'm traveling or doing research for these explainers, the last thing I want is to compromise my online privacy. CyberGhost encrypts your internet traffic and reroutes it through one of its secure servers, hiding your real IP address and protecting your connection. It also follows a strict no-logs policy, meaning CyberGhost doesn't track or store what you do online. This becomes especially important when you're using public Wi-Fi in airports, cafes, or hotels, which are some of the easiest places for your personal information to be intercepted. But once CyberGhost is turned on, your online activity is protected inside a secure, encrypted tunnel. CyberGhost has over 38 million users and an excellent rating on Trustpilot. CyberGhost also has servers in 100 countries, which is extremely useful for the kind of research we do. A local article, video, or streaming platform might be unavailable from where I am, but I can change my virtual location in just a couple of clicks and access the regional content I need. And if you're into Indonesian or other Asian horror movies, CyberGhost has streaming optimized servers for more than 40 international platforms, including Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney+, so you can access different content libraries depending on where you connect. It works across all major devices, and one subscription lets you protect up to 7 devices at the same time. Right now, CyberGhost is offering Asian Boss viewers 84% off, plus 4 extra months for free, all backed by a 45-day money-back guarantee. So scan the QR code or click the link in the description to try it completely risk-free and start protecting your privacy online. Alright, let's get back to more scary stories. So what exactly is a pocong and what's its origin story? Because let's face it, if you're not from Indonesia, it's definitely one of the more unique looking ghosts you'll ever come across. Indonesia isn't globally known for its supernatural culture in quite the same way Japan or Thailand are. So when most people picture an Asian ghost, they probably imagine a pale woman in white with long black hair covering her face, right? Well, actually, Indonesia has that too. Her name is Kuntilanak, the ghost of a woman believed to have died while pregnant or during childbirth. So she's the more conventionally scary looking one, at least to me, although I don't really scare easily. Anyway, according to the legend, she roams the earth grieving for the child she never got to raise and taking revenge on men, pregnant women, and even young children. Basically, Kuntilanak is Indonesia's version of the classic woman in white ghost. Along with pocong, they are widely regarded as the two giants of Indonesian ghost folklore, and either could reasonably claim the title of Indonesia's most famous ghost. So pocong means shrouded corpse, but what exactly is the body shrouded in, and why is it tied that way? To answer those questions, you first have to understand what happens to a body during a Muslim funeral in Indonesia. By the way, roughly 87% of the Indonesian population, or around 245 million people, identify as Muslim. But Islam was not native to these islands. It began spreading through Indonesia's busy maritime trade routes, especially from around the 13th century onward, as Muslim merchants settled in coastal ports, married into local communities, and religious teachers gained followers. So Indonesia did not become Muslim overnight. The process unfolded gradually over several centuries, allowing Islam to become layered on top of older indigenous and Hindu-Buddhist traditions. We're gonna get into all that because there are some crazy stories. For now, all you need to know is that pocong's entire appearance comes directly from what Indonesians see during a Muslim burial. From our research, this is what the funeral preparation process typically looks like in Indonesia. And if you're watching this from Indonesia and have any additional insights to add, do let our audience know. It begins with washing the body. The right side of the body is washed before the left, following instructions traditionally attributed to Prophet Muhammad when his daughter died. The entire body is then washed an odd number of times, usually 3 or 5 or more if necessary, and camphor or another fragrance may be added during the final rinse. The body is then wrapped from head to toe in plain white cloth called kain kafan, the burial shroud. Usually it is simple white cotton with no decoration or anything designed to display the person's wealth or status. Because in death, whether you're rich or poor, everyone is supposed to return to God wrapped in the same basic shroud. This is not unique to Indonesia, by the way, but a general Islamic funeral practice. The burial shroud is then secured with strips of the same cloth tied almost like cords at several points along the body. There are 5 ties, one above the head, one around the neck, one around the torso just below the folded arms, one around the knees, and one around the ankles. We couldn't find any deeper religious or historical significance behind those exact positions, but there appears to be a very practical reason for securing the body this way. In a typical Muslim burial in Indonesia, the deceased is not sealed inside a Western-style coffin before being buried. Instead, the body is carried to the cemetery on a covered funeral bier, spelled B-I-E-R, then physically lifted off the bier and lowered into the grave by hand. So without those ties, the overlapping layers of the shroud could loosen or come apart while the body is being carried and lowered into the ground. That makes sense. But here's the thing. Those ties are only supposed to be temporary. Once the body is resting safely inside the gravedigger or family members are supposed to loosen them before the body is covered with soil. But according to popular folklore, sometimes amid the grief, confusion, and haste of a funeral, that final step is forgotten. And once the grave is filled in, nobody can see that the body is still bound. This is where the legend begins. According to one popular version, the soul of the deceased remains close to the living world for 40 days as it transitions into the afterlife. On the 40th day, the soul is supposed to leave the earth for good. But if the physical ties are still in place, the soul remains trapped inside its own burial shroud and cannot move on. So out of the sheer desperation to be freed, the dead person rises from the grave and searches for someone who can untie the knots. But remember, when it rises, its arms are still pinned to its body and its legs are still tied at the ankles. So it can't walk or run like a normal person. Depending on which version of the story you hear, it can either float or it has to hop. That's the legend. Now, obviously, there's some pretty big holes in this theory. I mean, think about it. After all the careful washing, wrapping the body, carrying it to the cemetery, praying over it, and lowering it into the grave by hand, we are supposed to believe people just forget the very last step just because of grief and chaos? Really? The one step everybody knows creates a little pocong if you skip it. These rituals have been performed the same way for centuries by people who do this all the time and know exactly what they're doing. If anything, this is the part of the funeral they'll be most careful about. But look, this is meant to be a summer special episode, a break from our usual technical deep dives into business, tech, and current events. So for once, we're not going to fact check the accuracy of every ghost story. It's folklore, okay? But what's more interesting to me is the deeper spiritual origin of pocong. Not simply how it became a hopping ghost that scares the shit out of people, but why Indonesians were already prepared to believe that an improperly buried person could remain trapped among the living. Because while pocong itself could only have emerged after Islam introduced the white burial shroud, some of the ideas that make pocong frightening can be traced much further back to Indonesia's pre-Islamic traditions. Actually, we need to go even further back to a time before the first Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms emerged, when what is now called Indonesia was simply an enormous archipelago, a chain of more than 17,000 islands inhabited by many different peoples. Back then, communities across these islands already had their own indigenous traditions, including honoring ancestors and maintaining ritual relationships with local spirits. This is broadly known as animism, the belief that people, animals, natural places, and even certain objects can possess spiritual power or be inhabited by spirits. One surviving example comes from an indigenous community on the Indonesian side of Borneo, where the first burial is traditionally considered only temporary. During an elaborate ceremony called tiwa, which may take place years after somebody dies, the family reopens the grave, removes and cleans the bones, and transfers them into a special raised wooden tomb. Until that final ceremony is completed, the spirit is believed to remain unable to reach the realm of the dead. So in some of Indonesia's oldest spiritual traditions, simply burying someone was not enough. If the proper final rituals were left incomplete, the soul could remain trapped, unable to finish its journey into the afterlife. And that basic belief that the dead can become stuck because the living fail to complete the burial properly is one of the oldest supernatural ideas that helps us understand why the pocong legend would later make sense to Indonesians. Then Hinduism and Buddhism gradually arrived through maritime trade with India. By around the 4th and 5th centuries, Hindu-influenced kingdoms had begun appearing in places such as Borneo and Western Java. Different regional rulers adapted Hinduism, Buddhism, and Indian ideas to strengthen their authority and connect themselves to the wider trading world. But interestingly enough, the older animist beliefs did not disappear. Instead, they blended with Hindu gods, demons, and mantras and ritual magic. One clear example is the legend of Chalunarang, a story set in the 11th century East Java about a widow believed to possess extremely powerful black magic. According to the story, Chalunarang was a widow and powerful sorceress who became furious when no one would marry her daughter because the entire village was terrified of her. So at midnight, she took her followers into a cemetery to seek help from Durga. Now, Durga is a major Hindu goddess with many different forms, but in this localized version of the story, she's portrayed as a terrifying goddess who lives in the cemetery and has the power to grant Chalunarang permission to harm the living. So how did Chalunarang ask for Durga's permission? By offering a sacrifice. The details get pretty graphic here, but this is according to the oldest surviving version of the tale, translated from an old Javanese manuscript. The legend has it that she and her followers selected a recently deceased corpse from the cemetery and literally brought it back to life. But just as the revived man began thanking her, one of Chalunarang's followers cut his throat with a machete. Chalunarang then washed her hair in his blood, wore his intestines around her neck, and offered his body to Durga, who then allowed her to unleash a plague across the kingdom. Basically, the revived corpse was sacrificed as an offering to obtain greater supernatural power. The man who eventually defeats Chalunarang is a holy man named Ampubarada. His student secretly obtains Chalunarang's magical book after marrying her daughter. Once Barada reads the book, he understands how powers work. He neutralizes Chalunarang's power and kills her, only to realize that she has died without having her soul purified. So he brings her back to life, gives her a chance to cleanse herself spiritually, and then allows her to die again before her body is cremated. Pretty crazy stuff, right? The point is that this Hindu-era legend adds another important ingredient to Indonesia's supernatural imagination. The idea that cemeteries were places where the boundary between life and death could be manipulated, corpses could return, and even dying did not guarantee that a person's soul had properly moved on. And that, essentially, is how the pocong emerged. Not from one single religion, but from centuries of beliefs layered on top of one another. Indigenous animism supplied the idea that spirits could remain in the world of the living. Hindu-era legends added stories of corpses being revived and souls failing to move on properly. And Islam gave the ghost its unmistakable physical form, a dead body still bound in its burial shroud. We don't know exactly when the first pocong story appeared, but the figure seems to have developed gradually in Japanese folklore before reaching Indonesian cinema in the 1970s and exploded in popular culture in the early 2000s. But the pocong is only the beginning, because Indonesia's supernatural world goes far beyond ghosts into rituals, curses, and forms of black magic so widely feared that offering supernatural services intended to harm somebody is now explicitly criminalized under the country's new criminal code. If you thought Chalunarang, the crazy powerful sorceress we just covered, was merely a mythical character from some ancient manuscript, think again. Because modern-day Indonesia has no shortage of people who claim to possess supernatural powers. But they're not usually called sorcerers or practitioners of black magic. The most common term is dukun, which roughly translates to traditional healer or shaman. Many claim to heal illnesses, predict the future, remove curses, or provide spiritual protection. But some are also believed to use their powers to manipulate, injure, or even kill other people. Now, what I should make clear is that this is not fringe. This is not just a handful of weird villages out in the middle of nowhere. In a 2012 survey, the Pew Research Center found that 69% of Indonesian Muslims believed witchcraft was real. That's almost 7 out of 10. Now, that figure is more than a decade old, so we couldn't find a more recent national survey asking the same question. So make of the result what you will. But among Indonesian Muslims, it certainly appears that belief in witchcraft is not the exception. It's closer to the default. And I'm not even talking about ordinary people. Belief in supernatural power has reportedly reached all the way to the highest levels of Indonesian politics. Take Suharto, for example, the authoritarian president who ruled Indonesia for more than 3 decades, from 1967 to 1998. Long before becoming president, Suharto studied under a Javanese mystic, and even after taking office, he reportedly continued consulting mystics and spiritual advisors. And this did not end with Suharto. During the 2009 presidential election, sitting president Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono publicly said that people were using black magic during the election. This was the president himself during his own re-election campaign openly saying that supernatural forces were being used against him. And several years later, Yudhoyono revealed that even a stranger experience in his memoir. He wrote that shortly before the 2009 election, his wife suddenly screamed after seeing a thick, dark cloud hovering beneath the ceiling of their home and trying to enter their bedroom. He described the incident as something out of a horror movie, but insisted that it really did happen. The point is that belief in these supernatural forces has been so mainstream that Indonesian presidents have openly discussed their own experiences without being ridiculed by the public. So if presidents believe in it, and nearly 7 out of 10 Indonesian Muslims say witchcraft exists, the obvious question becomes, what exactly are they so afraid of? What does the darkest side of the black magic world actually look like? That's where we first have to talk about santet, the form of black magic Indonesians most commonly associate with deliberately attacking another person. Santet does not have a perfect one-word English translation, but the closest equivalent would be a curse. A supernatural attack intentionally directed at a specific person. It's basically the gateway into Indonesia's black magic world because, trust me, it gets much darker from here. But santet itself is no joke. Typically, the person seeking revenge does not perform the ritual themselves. They hire a dukun santet, a shaman who specializes in placing curses, who may supposedly use the victim's name, photograph, hair, clothing, or some other personal connection to direct the curse towards them. And unlike a physical attack, santet is believed to work from a distance. The person who commissioned it could be living hundreds of miles away, while the victim may have no idea who's targeting them or why. That is essentially the premise of the 2024 Indonesian horror film Santet Segoro Pitu. Spoiler alert. After a successful merchant receives this mysterious package, he, his wife, and their youngest son begin falling seriously ill one by one, and his wife and the youngest son eventually die. The attack is ultimately traced to a rival merchant who used black magic to drive him out of business. The film reached #1 on a major Indonesian box office chart during its opening week, which tells you how familiar and compelling this idea remains to mainstream Indonesian audiences. And what makes santet so terrifying is that according to the belief, it can manifest in almost any form. The victim might suddenly experience unbearable pain, vomiting, paralysis, hallucinations, or a mysterious illness that doctors cannot explain. In the most graphic stories, nails, needles, pieces of glass, or even insects are said to appear inside the victim's body. Putting aside the obvious scientific question of how that could even be possible, one of Indonesia's biggest recent santet stories involved model and influencer Stebi Ignacia. For several years, Stebi said that she had been suffering from unexplained health problems. Then in September 2023, she posted an X-ray that appeared to show 2 long, solid objects near her pelvic area. Her doctor asked whether she had an IUD or some other form of birth control, but Stebi insisted that she had never had anything inserted into her body. Stebi interpreted the objects as physical evidence that someone had attacked her with santet. She said she believed someone had targeted her with a santet and even asked that person on social media to stop the curse. Then 6 months later, Stebby died in hospital just at the age of 32. Almost immediately, people online began speculating that the curse had finally killed her. But to be clear, there was no medical evidence establishing that Sentet or the unexplained objects seen in the X-ray caused her death. But cursing an enemy is not even the darkest practice associated with Indonesia's supernatural world. There's also pesugihan, the pursuit of instant wealth through a pact with a supernatural being. Basically a deal with the devil, Indonesian style. And in the darkest versions, the wealth requires a sacrifice, sometimes even a human life. And fair warning, this next case is genuinely disturbing. In 2021, a family in Goa, South Sulawesi, was accused of seriously harming their 6-year-old daughter during what police suspected was a black magic ritual. Thankfully, the girl survived, but her 22-year-old sibling had died just 1 day earlier under suspicious circumstances following what relatives described as another ritual. Police investigated as a pesugihan case, though they never conclusively established what happened. So if there's this much demand for supernatural power, whether it be taking revenge on somebody, protecting yourself from a curse, or become rich through a sacrifice, what do you think some of the shamans who claim they can make those things happen would do? Inevitably, they would turn those claims into a thriving business. In some cases, what begins as a private spiritual consultation can grow into an entire operation built around followers handing over their savings in exchange for miracles. And that is exactly what a dukun named Mbah Slamet did. Slamet reportedly attracted clients through Facebook and claimed that he could supernaturally multiply the money they entrusted to him. It was a scam, and there was no evidence that he ever delivered any genuine returns. But when his clients began demanding their promised money back, Slamet invited them to participate in one final ritual, during which he gave them a drink laced with cyanide and poisoned them all to death. Police arrested Slamet in 2023 and eventually uncovered 12 bodies. In February 2024, he was sentenced to death. But look, I don't want to create the cultural stereotype that Indonesia is full of shamans practicing dark magic, because the reality is that most of them simply offer spiritual help and meet a genuine market demand. These days, Indonesians looking for supernatural help do not necessarily have to travel to some remote village and ask around for a mysterious shaman. Practitioners advertise through Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, offering services such as attracting love, bringing success to a business, recovering stolen property, or removing a curse. But it is entirely possible that a subset of shamans specializes in much darker practices. This is the problem Indonesia had been wrestling with long before Mbah Slamet. How do you prosecute someone who claims they can injure or kill another person using black magic when no court can scientifically prove that black magic even works? And this was not just some theoretical legal debate. In 1998, around 100 people accused of practicing Santet were killed in East Java. The accusations often began after a personal dispute, when someone suddenly became sick or died or suffered some other unexplained misfortune. And the community blamed the suspected dukun. From the village's perspective, the law was protecting the people they believed were cursing and attacking them while punishing anyone who tried to fight back. From the government's perspective, however, people were being murdered based on accusations that could never be proven. Indonesian lawmakers had been trying to solve this problem for decades. A new national criminal code had been under discussion since at least 1981, and successive drafts repeatedly included some form of anti-sorcery provision. So that is how seriously Indonesia takes its supernatural culture. It is now one of the very few countries in the world to criminalize the sale of supernatural services intended to harm others at the national level. That means the Indonesian government is at least officially acknowledging that belief in the supernatural is real and widespread enough in Indonesia to create serious consequences. And perhaps what is even more fascinating is that the same ghost and black magic considered serious enough to make their way into the criminal code have also become the raw material for some of the country's biggest entertainment. Because in Indonesia, the supernatural is not only something people fear or pay for, it has also become an entire industry that people pay to watch. So what do you think is the natural next step for a country with this many ghosts, curses, rituals, and supernatural stories already embedded in its culture? I don't know, maybe you turn them into horror movies? Right now, there's a bit of a low-budget horror renaissance going on around the world. Just look at two of the biggest surprise hits of 2026, Obsession and Backrooms. Both became massive box office hits. Obsession was created by 26-year-old YouTuber Curry Barker, while Backrooms grew out of a viral YouTube horror series created by Kane Parsons, who was only 16 when he started the series. Basically, young filmmakers with creative ideas and relatively small budgets are now beating Hollywood at one of its own games. And it makes sense because horror is arguably the most accessible genre for filmmakers without much money or industry experience. Production can often be confined largely to one location, which keeps the budget low, while the upside can be absolutely enormous through words of mouth and viral buzz. Just look at Obsession, which reportedly cost only $750,000 to make and went on to gross more than $400 million worldwide, more than 500 times its production budget. Sometimes all you need is one disturbing idea, a few relatively unknown actors, a creepy location, and a good sound designer. And while Hollywood writers often have to build an entirely new supernatural mythology from scratch, Indonesian filmmakers already have access to an almost unlimited supply of horror source material embedded in their culture. There is actually one more element that Hollywood is just discovering or rediscovering, something that Indonesia industrialized 2 decades ago, but I'll come back to that. What's interesting is that horror movies are kind of a big deal in Indonesia, which again, I did not expect. According to the Indonesian Film Board, roughly 60% of the country's domestic film productions in 2024 were horror movies. Together, they sold around 54.6 million tickets, accounting for roughly 70% of the total audience. In other words, horror is not some niche corner of Indonesian cinema. It practically dominates the industry. And that brings us back to the pocong, the white-shrouded hopping ghost. As recently as 2023, 2 separate pocong movies released only weeks apart each crossed 1 million admissions, proving the ghost's staying power nearly half a century after its first major screen appearance. The earliest identified Indonesian film to feature a hopping pocong as its main ghost was Setan Kuburan, which was released in 1975 as a horror comedy. But Indonesia's horror movie industry has not always been this successful. In fact, the country's whole movie industry nearly collapsed during the 1990s. Part of the problem began under President Suharto's authoritarian New Order, which lasted from 1966 to 1998. Particularly after a new film code of ethics was introduced in 1981, Indonesian horror filmmakers were expected to follow a fairly predictable moral formula that basically killed their creative freedom to tell good stories. Basically, evil could terrorize people for most of the movie, but by the end, a religious authority would usually arrive to defeat it and restore order. The message was that ghosts, curses, and black magic might be powerful, but religious faith and respectable authority were ultimately more powerful. If you didn't follow this formula, your film risked running into censorship problems or being banned. But censorship was only one part of the problem. Private television expanded rapidly during the 1990s, which meant Indonesians had a ton of entertainment they could watch at home for free. At the same time, imported Hollywood movies increasingly dominated the country's more profitable cinemas. So local producers and directors increasingly turned to cheap, mainly sexual exploitation movies in a desperate attempt to lure audiences back. As a result, Indonesian cinema, and horror films in particular, became associated with low-quality productions shown mainly in lower-end and rural theaters. By the time the Asian financial crisis struck in 1997 and 1998, the Indonesian movie industry was already pretty much done. The crisis brought domestic feature film production to a halt. So take a guess what helped to bring the local movie industry back. That's right, horror movies. It started with a movie called Jelangkung in 2001, named after an Indonesian ritual used to summon spirits through a small homemade doll. The story followed 4 young people from Jakarta who traveled around investigating haunted locations before one of them performed a ritual over a mysterious grave and accidentally brought something home with them. What made Jelangkung so significant was that it felt completely different from the formulaic horror movies produced during the dictatorship period. There was no all-powerful religious authority who suddenly appeared at the end to defeat the ghost and lecture everybody about morality. Instead, the movie focused on young urban characters, local ghost stories, and the feeling that these supernatural events could follow any ordinary Indonesians back into modern Jakarta. And that success sent a very clear message to investors. Indonesians were still willing to pay to watch local movies. You just had to give them stories they actually cared about. Jelangkung provided a new blueprint. Take a familiar supernatural belief, update it for a younger urban audience, keep the production relatively cheap, and let word of mouth do the rest. But Indonesian horror filmmakers would eventually take that one model one step further. Instead of waiting for audiences to discover a horror story after the movie was released, what if the story already had millions of fans before production even began? I mean, that's exactly what happened with Backrooms, which grew out of director Kane Parsons' hugely popular YouTube horror series, right? Indonesia had already cracked that code in 2019 when an anonymous Twitter thread about 6 university students encountering something supernatural in a remote village went viral. The thread went viral largely because it was presented as a supposedly true account. By concealing the real names and location, the anonymous writer left readers to examine the clues, debate where the village might be, and decide for themselves whether any of it was real. People felt like they were collectively investigating a mystery as it spread across social media. 3 years later, in 2022, that story was made into a movie called Curse of the Dancing Village. When it finally opened, people waited for hours outside some cinema, and screenings sold out. The film eventually became the most watched Indonesian movie in history at the time. It took an existing online investigation and all the curiosity, theories, and emotional investment surrounding it and converted that into one of the largest cinema audiences Indonesia had ever seen. There's your blueprint for an almost guaranteed horror hit, if there ever was one. And that may be Indonesia's greatest horror advantage. They're reviving stories people heard from their grandparents, rumors they encountered online, and supernatural figures they may already believe are real. And perhaps no character demonstrates that advantage better than the pocong. During the commercial revival of Indonesian horror in the 2000s, filmmakers turned the pocong into a repeatable franchise character, producing 37 pocong-led movies between 2000 and 2020. From an Indonesian filmmaker's perspective, it was almost perfect for a low-budget horror industry with a built-in fan base. Think about it. Put an actor inside a white shroud, add some makeup, lighting, and sound effects, and the audience immediately knows what it is and what kind of fear it represents. Filmmakers also quickly realized how versatile the character could be. It could appear in serious horror movies, low-budget sequels, television series, and horror comedies. By the late 2000s, Indonesian cinemas were producing titles such as Pocong 2, Pocong 3, Pocong vs. Kuntilanak, and numerous other variations. But here's what's fascinating. By repeatedly depicting and commercializing the pocong, Indonesia's film industry helped define what modern pocong was supposed to look and act like for younger generations who may not have been as familiar with the original folklore. The white shroud, grotesque face, and stiff hopping movement became so iconic that they created a strange feedback loop. Folklore gave filmmakers the pocong. Movies made the pocong even more famous. And young Indonesians then imitated through pranks, viral videos, and supposedly real-life sightings, generating even more material for popular culture. Social media and AI only accelerated that loop by making convincing footage easier to create and harder to verify. In May 2026, the same pocong videos were reposted with different location labels across central Java, causing enough public alarm that police conducted cyber patrols, checked the locations, debunked the rumors, and increased the night patrols. So this is already becoming a real-world public order issue beyond just entertainment. But beyond those concerns, here is the billion-dollar question. Is it possible for Indonesian horror to become a truly global cultural export? Creatively, Indonesian horror may already be capable of standing alongside Thailand and Japan, but commercially, Indonesia still lacks that one defining international breakthrough. Where is its equivalent of Japan's Ring, the film that made the entire world take notice of Japanese horror and turned the J-horror into an internationally recognizable brand? Thailand has also built a strong regional and international reputation through movies like Shudder. Indonesia has successful films and respected directors, but the average global viewer probably still could not name a single Indonesian ghost or immediately describe what makes Indonesian horror distinctive. That's a shame because as a horror movie fan, I've seen some Indonesian horror movies that are totally on another level. So what's stopping them? One possible explanation is that Indonesia's domestic film industry has become a victim of its own growth. In 2025, roughly 400 completed Indonesian films were reportedly waiting to be released, all competing for space in a country with just over 22,000 cinema screens for a population of around 286 million. So before Indonesian horror can conquer the world, many Indonesian filmmakers first have to compete for the chance to be seen in their own country. Then there is the challenge of cultural translation. Indonesian horror draws from Islamic burial traditions, black magic, spiritual healers, and supernatural creatures that many foreign viewers have never encountered. That unfamiliarity might be part of what makes Indonesian horror so fresh, but filmmakers have to provide enough context for outsiders to understand why these things are frightening without stripping away what makes them uniquely Indonesian. That's a tall order. The bottom line is that Indonesian horror does not lack the talent or the stories to go global. What it might lack is the industry infrastructure to give that breakthrough film a chance to emerge, release it successfully at home, secure meaningful international distribution, and then turn one global hit into a lasting cultural movement. Indonesian horror may already be ready for the world. The question is whether the industry surrounding it is ready to take it there. I hope you enjoyed the summer special episode and weren't too scared listening to these stories. Normally, we cover more business, tech insights, as well as current events from across Asia. But if you still found this video culturally insightful and feel better informed as a result, subscribe to Asian Boss, hit that notification bell, and share this video with your family and friends that like horror stuff. Also, don't forget to click the link in the description to grab the special CyberGhost VPN discount. It keeps your data safe while you browse and unlocks blocked content online, all for just $2 a month. It's completely risk-free, so check it out today. Our mission is to be your authentic go-to source for all Asia-related insights, and we'll continue bringing you the most in-depth, objective reporting straight from the ground. And if you're watching this from Indonesia and want to contribute your local insight to our future Indonesia-related explainers, now's your chance. Fill out the form in the description, submit a short video intro, and tell us what kind of insights you can share from Indonesia with our global audience. I'll personally review your submission and get in touch if we can invite you to join a future live stream session. Think of it like letting the audience see how we conduct a straight interview in real time with no edits. We can even brainstorm future topics together. This is how serious we are about building a truly authentic media platform that can challenge mainstream media, and I hope you'll be a part of it. Of course, I'm Stephen Park. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. And as always, stay curious.